All right, Andrea, tell me about the influence of your mother.
My mom taught me about color, in short. She was a knitter and an embroiderer. She really didn't like using the sewing machine. So early on, because of the budget of the family and my being given a $3 limit on clothes allowance per item, it was obvious that I had to make my own clothes. And I used to love going to the 5 and 10 cent store. It was the 50s. There were all these very cute conversational cottons there, and I would take hours choosing just the right pattern and stuff. But my mom taught me about color with her knitting and just using materials, paper, knitting. And she really taught us all how to see color. So we worked out a deal where I would sew and she would do the hand finishing.
She taught you how to sew and knit and embroider?
No,
Oh.
she did all of that. I only had to work the sewing machine. It was a very good deal for each of us.
Mm-hmm. So, and what specifically about color did she teach you?
We just looked at color together.
Okay.
We looked at, the difference between this green and this green and that green and which one you like better and where does it fit in with this rust and what kind of a palette. I would say putting together palettes they weren't like formal lessons. It was just something we did together.
Mm-hmm. And then what was fashion like when you were growing up?
Fashion was in the 50s very much about shirtwaist dresses. I had to learn to sew extra straight. It was really excruciating, but I did it.
Mm-hmm. And then fashion in the 60s while you were in high school and college?
Yeah, that was a little bit looser. And when I did Dakota Transit, we did hot pants, we did lots of fringes. I don't think I was so much an originator of shapes of garments as I was of surfaces and decoration.
Mm-hmm.
So some editor at Vogue would say, look, maybe hot pants should be something you want to think about this season. That's it. Oh, yes, okay, of course.
They would say that to you in person or in writing?
No, just by phone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you would say, okay, hot pants.
Yeah. So they'd still kind of give me clues about the kind of stuff they wanted to do editorials with, and they liked my interpretations, but it wasn't me who said, oh, hot pants must be the next thing. I really had no connection with the fashion industry.
No connection?
It's just through the magazines.
But Vogue would call you and give
Yeah.
you suggestions.
Right, because they liked using my stuff.
Okay, so they would sort of use you in a way, or...
Well, you know how it goes. We use each other.
Have you seen The Devil Wears Prada? The movie?
Yeah.
Was that what Vogue was like back then?
I wasn't up in the Vogue office as much. They'd come down to the store. I mean, in fact, I was very rarely there. They'd come to the store. Occasionally, I'd go to shoots. Like, I watched Francesco Scavullo do a shoot. That was great. I mean, it was very interesting to work with the photographers. I mean, I wasn't working. I was just observing, but it was exciting.
How did it feel to see your work in Vogue magazine?
Yeah, that felt quite good. Thank you very much. That was good. Exciting.
Did you ever use cerulean blue in a sweater? That's a reference to the movie. Then what was fashion like in Peru, both in the indigenous cultures and...
Fashion exists everywhere. I think you get women like checking each other out, and they don't want to look like their mothers. Even if to a Western eye it's only a slight deviation, like it's the same kind of pattern but in a different color, to their eye it's dated. And so it's not so obvious as the swings in the West, but they surely have their opinions.
And then what's ethnographic, what's it called, ethnographic textile, or what did you do in Peru, freelance, or self?
In Peru, I made collections of what was indigenous to different villages and different situations. For example, Peru has a layer of Catholicism on top of all the traditional stuff, so they celebrate fiestas, saints' days. Each village has a saint and a saint's day and a special celebration, traditional dances that are done at that time. And it's a big departure from everyday life in what they wear as well as what they do. Everyday life for these mountain people is pretty hard. They're raising animals or they're farming with very primitive tools, no heat in the houses, etc., etc. It's hard. But on the fiesta days, they go crazy. There's usually a patron couple that puts up the money for bands, for food. It's several days of getting ready. They wear special clothes, embroidered clothes for the dances. And everyday stuff is woven on backstrap looms or tapestry looms. So it's like night and day. It's a real departure.
Mm-hmm.
So I went around taking pictures of those kind of events. And I liked the music, but I didn't have the means to record the music. But for me, that was an important part, so I photographed the musicians, the instruments.
What kind of camera would you
And
use?
take note. Very simple, automatic one for slides.
For slides?
Yeah.
And how many rolls of slide film would you take with you when you would go to a village?
I never had enough film. It was like chief expense of being in Peru in those years, really, because the house we rented was only $12 a month. It was a big colonial house, plenty of rooms, but film.
And that would be you and Chad, your son?
Yeah, that would be me and Shad and Caleb's father, and then the second part of Peru, Caleb was there as well. So, yeah, Peru was in 2 phases, 2.5 years, 2 years back in New York, then another 2.5 years roughly until the Sendero Luminoso chased us away in 1980.
The who?
The
Shining Path.
Shining Path. Sorry.
Okay, and they were a political force, a part of the government, or?
Yeah, they were a political force.
Okay. And Caleb, where was Caleb born?
He was born in the city.
In New York City?
Yep.
Okay. What would you say are the differences between sort of the fashion world and the textiles you would see in these indigenous cities?
Well, the indigenous cities didn't have much worldwide fashion reference, to say the least. They might have been to Lima sometime or seen some magazines from Lima, but they're mostly just local. So that was the limit of their world, which, as mine used to be, Springfield, Massachusetts.
True. What was your biggest challenge of living in a place like Peru?
It was a little bit cold. I was living up over 10,000 feet most of the time I was there.
Oh, wow.
Kind of chilly.
About 2 miles up or so.
Yeah.
What was the name of the city?
Oh, the last part of my stay was in Jauja, which was 7 hours east of Lima, up in the mountains.
How many people lived in that city?
I'm not exactly sure.
And were you most of the time a woman with children traveling alone?
No, most of the time I was a woman with children traveling with a guy.
Okay. Just checking. And what do you think were people's perceptions of you when you would come in?
I think they were always amazed that I would put up with these very difficult physical conditions to visit them and their culture, and amazed that I was so interested in why they did things. I was asking the meaning of motifs or how did they prepare it. I mean, most people in the world that I've interviewed and followed were delighted that someone was interested in what they were doing,
Mm-hmm.
because they thought it was a little bit primitive or a little bit specific, and they were surprised that someone took an interest in it. So given that, they would be happy to show me around and try and explain things to me, even if the language was a big difficulty.
So would you say you started collecting textiles in Peru? That was the beginning of your...
Absolutely. Yeah, that was the first time I tried to do it systematically to show what was indigenous to a place. And I'd always try and collect the oldest to the newest, so I could show a range of development, and then attempt to explain why this had happened.
Do you have many pieces in the current collection that are from Peru?
I have a large Peruvian collection, but when I left Peru in 1980, I sold half of those holdings to the British Museum, about 400 pieces. So I have another 400.
Mm-hmm. Where did you go after Peru? After you
From
were chased
Peru, I
out?
went directly to London because there was so much trouble with the civil war in Peru. My nerves were ruined. So I decided I wanted to go to a safe, boring place. And that was London, clearly. In my mind, there was no question.
And what did you do in London?
In London, I took this collection to the British Museum, and they were very interested in it. And they assigned a person to me for 6 months, and we worked every day, and she pulled every scrap of information out of me and wrote it up. And so they have a very well documented collection there now.
And is it the Andrea Arno collection there at the British Museum, or
Yes, it's listed under my name.
that must feel good and validating? Or?
Yes, I'm hoping that collection is going to be exhibited before I pass on to the next world. But yes, it's good to know that it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what we can do with that.
Where were you living in London?
In London, we lived in a place called Chalk Farm in the northwest of town.
Okay. I lived in London for 3 months, so
Uh-huh.
I have a little frame of reference. And then, what was it like to work with the British Museum? I mean, after you studied at Brown history, and then here you are in sort of one of the biggest institutions of history in Western culture.
Well, it's very good. They were really professional. And they were, on that occasion and in subsequent occasions, they proved to me that they were in line with my way of thinking. Because years later, when I was in Japan and when I was again collecting a project which I self-funded because no one was very interested, it was validated by the Japanese keeper from the British Museum, who said, "Oh yes, we really like what you're doing, that you're collecting rather modern stuff. We don't like waiting 200 or 300 years before we invest. We like to buy many cheaply, close to the date, and have them as a reference." So that was good for me. The British Museum was not just resting on their laurels of their antiquities collections, but also interested in living cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
How long were you in the UK? And then tell me the sort of different, how you eventually returned back to New York.
I was in the UK based for a few years. From there, I made little trips out to Afghanistan and Asia. Made my first trip to Asia had been in '74, but from the London base, I made my early trips to Burma and then to China, which was just tiny bit beginning to open to independent travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And I always pushed the limit. And after making a few trips out to China, squeezing them into the kids' school vacations, we went to China for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
when the kids were out of school, and we just traveled for one whole year, going to minority group cultures in China. So that was significant.
And you traveled the whole year while you were in China?
Yeah,
You weren't based in one place?
right. Because it took a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Very limited Mandarin on my part, limited Mandarin on the part of the people I wanted to hang out with, lots of government restrictions, lots of getting stopped and sent back, and self-criticisms to write. And but at the bottom of all that, difficulty with the government, with the language, with many things, the people were so curious, especially because I was traveling with children. I mean, they could not resist to creep up. And, you know, as shy as they were, they had to see this kid.
How old were your children?
The kids were 5 and 12.
Wow.
Yeah,
Caleb was 5 and Shad was 12.
yeah, exactly. And Caleb just paid no attention to language, just played with the kids. You know, they talked, he talked, you know, didn't matter that they couldn't understand each other, they played.